Hello everybody, it's me. So, I'm settling into more of a routine now, but then events in my personal life also began to cause problems and make motivation difficult yet again. Basically, though, I think that trouble is mostly going to be over now. Regardless of whether it is or not, stuff's been happening in the community that's got me really excited, and I sort of just have to do this. It's got me really motivated. So, onwards into the video. Today I'm going to be discussing some of the largest events which have happened recently, and stuff which, as of my New Year prediction video, I definitely didn't predict. This is going to be something of a longer video, because since I haven't produced a detailed video describing the functionality of Uchu yet, I'm going to be discussing Uchu for quite a bit in this one, because honestly I think you'd all be quite interested to hear about it. As of New Year, I was mostly focusing on DLU and LCDIU, predicting they would have server openings this year. I mentioned that Uchu's making progress, I think, but honestly at that stage I remember being more interested in the progress I saw Crooks making, probably solely because I was keeping up with their GitHub commits and not with Uchu's. Anyway, this meant that, quite honestly, I didn't have a great idea where Uchu was. This changed quite significantly, however, when Winston published his Thoughts on LEGO Universe video, which I would strongly recommend you check out. It's really interesting and far better written than most of my content. He talked to me a little before posting it, and once he had, I suggested we do some collaboration in order to raise his profile. This ended with us playing Uchu and uncovering quite a few interesting glitches, and got me to take a much closer look at Uchu than I previously had. I should explain that most people who've been in the community for a while fairly quickly begin to expect nothing much of open source servers. It's mostly remnants of projects like Uni, but it has left a bad taste in the mouths of the community. In that previous video, you'll notice I talk a fair amount about how I thought it was really nice to see Uchu getting some respect from devs, as it's probably the first open source server we've ever really had so far that is actually well regarded by them. Maybe Woolers to some extent, but that didn't last long being actively developed. And so, whilst I was seeing good reactions to Uchu, my hopes just automatically weren't that high. I was sort of in the position of, okay, Uchu's doing well, maybe if we're lucky at some point it'll become good enough to run a public server on. But since it had a reputation for being hard to set up and run, I had never bothered trying myself, and so had vanishingly little experience with it. And so whilst I was seeing its growth, I was seeing it as something interesting, yes, but not particularly groundbreaking. And I was really wrong. The first thing that struck me as I began to learn more about Uchu was how little noise Winston makes about it. It's got a lot of stuff. He mentions in his video that projects hyping themselves up has a tendency to damage them by giving the community unrealistic expectations, which require more and more developer hours to fulfill, and which doesn't result in any form of congratulations, since the people waiting on the servers somehow now see it as their due, rather than as a gift from a dev who spent days working on it. And so, sticking very religiously to that principle, he's been working on it without any fanfare whatsoever, as well as, by his other principle, keeping it completely open source. The only downside to this is that this is a channel dedicated to discussing progress in the community, and whether Winston likes it or not, Uchu has made significant progress, and so I feel the need to discuss it. However, what I really don't want to do is damage the project by hyping it up. So what I would suggest, therefore, is this. I'm going to discuss my thoughts on Uchu here, but those are my personal thoughts, and I would urge you to try out Uchu yourselves and come to your own conclusions, and don't base your opinion on the trajectory of the progress. Uchu has a reputation of being hard to set up, but honestly, I think it's been exaggerated. I'm not great with Git, I'm a programmer, but honestly, I find downloading the code most difficult most of the time. And I managed to set it up without any troubles at all from the instructions Winston gave. But since I'm sure you'll be thinking about its trajectory when you play, I'll say it right now. Uchu's trajectory is looking pretty good. But recently I've really learnt how real life can put a dent in that. It's so easy for you to have a good trajectory and get knocked out of the air. Motivation is really fickle, and when you're doing something for free, it is the only thing you have to keep you going, so it's impossible to judge a project on its trajectory. Instead, I urge you to judge based on its achievements. So, opinions on Uchu. Well, actually, what is Uchu? Uchu is a collaboration between the user Yui and Winston. It's been around for a little while, but since Winston started working on it in July of 2019, it has seen a huge amount of progress, and he has worked very hard on it, becoming its main active developer. Anyway, having given some context as to how recent this project is, what's it like at the moment? Uchu has varying playability of missions. At the moment there are glitches when the server is meant to give you items, meaning that you can proceed without fault only up to Epsilon's mission giving you a weapon. However, if you buy a weapon you can continue with the quest chain up to the point of the survival minigame, since minigames just aren't implemented. To give you an idea of what this means in terms of code, we can walk through the game a little bit. You wake up on the Venture Explorer, missions are implemented, and so you actually can wake up. You can smash crates, noting you don't get any imagination from them until you've unlocked it, which I've looked at previously, and although on personal hosted instances this can be a little laggy, crates tend to work pretty well. Unlocking your imagination goes fine, and you see something that very few other projects have implemented, a script where, rarely, a chicken will drop from a Venture Explorer crate. Genuinely, I don't think I actually knew this was a thing until Uchu. You can then build your rocket and escape, noticing a minor bug where completing the mission doesn't kick you out of build mode automatically and you need to exit manually. You arrive in Avant Gardens. I've noticed some buggy world loading in terms of what you see as it's loading, and missing the landing animation, but nothing major at all, nothing gameplay related. You'll notice straight away, however, some targets around the place in Avant Gardens. This is because Winston has spawned in all objects, regardless of whether or not they have a script attached to them, so the targets, which are used as part of a later mission, are spawned in by the game, but presumably the script, which hasn't been implemented, can't make them invisible. You run through Avant Gardens and notice, interestingly, that enemy AI is possibly more live accurate than that on LCDRU. I would also compare it to DLU, but during their testing with enemy AI, it was impossible to work out stuff like how well hits registered and collisions were tested with all the lag. And honestly, at the time, I was mostly just typed they had AI and didn't look into analysing it. I've only started doing that in retrospect now. Also, multiple different attacks all work, if the enemies are meant to have them implemented. It's nice because, unlike in LCDRU, ranged attacks work pretty well, and so there's something of a challenge to fighting the enemies, even something as simple as a mech. The eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that spawning differs from LCDRU. I believe that spawning in the game is determined by spawn paths, each path containing multiple enemies to be spawned in a series. Uchu hasn't implemented this, and just spawns the first enemy in a series. I'm not completely certain to what extent LCDRU has implemented it. Certain things make me think it has been implemented completely, and other things make me think less certain, so who knows. Regardless, this is a pretty minor point which you probably wouldn't notice if you weren't either a dev or someone like me who's literally just scouring the games for these things. And that's about where progress on the game ends. Stuff like the monument doesn't completely work, and for any stuff from there on in, there's a relatively even chance as to whether or not the systems implemented for previous content will cover it. But that's true of all projects. There's some interesting stuff to note about, say, how the Spider Queen, although you can't play her instance, is pretty well implemented in terms of her attacks, although she doesn't always rotate to play animations, if you spawn her in, and in general the AI does seem pretty good. And that's one thing I think I should actually note, because something that's in common with both LCDRU and DLU, and I think all the Op Crux videos I've seen as well, is that they typically don't discuss anything later in the game than wherever they're up to in testing. And it's quite nice to see Uchu at the moment to just be able to look at Crux Prime. It may not be completely implemented, but it's quite nice to be able to run around the unimplemented version and see what's there and what isn't. It certainly makes my job a lot easier. But anyway, that's not really what's been exciting me with Uchu. You may have already seen my discussion of Uchu's scripting capabilities, so I'm not going to go into detail on those here, other than to mention that the other night I was working on a relatively short tutorial describing how you can make your own mod for Uchu, so stay tuned for that if you're interested in modding. The reason I bring it up is because it lets me make what I like to think is a neat segue into one of the first major announcements for this video, Reins Modpack. This program is meant to be, when completed, a single program which can patch you through to the server you want to run, and which can load client mods from a predefined list in your client. It's not quite there yet with the last bit, but it does have some very interesting stuff contained within it, foremost amongst which is a JSON, or it might be XML, I haven't tested this much yet so I don't remember off the top of my head, I think it's JSON, to FTB converter. For those of you who don't know, the FTB is the internal database sort of structure, the file format's what I'm going for. And so this allows you to edit the game's internal database, which in turn makes all sorts of modding hugely possible. And yeah, this is quite a large breakthrough. I previously talked about Vincent releasing his FTB converter in his Infected Rose library, but it wasn't hugely friendly to the average user, and he apparently had his own concerns about stability. Hopefully, with a dedicated executable, we could now be in a position where people are able to finally create their own client mods more easily. Depending on how well this works out, I may do a video experimenting with this sometime soon. Also, if the mod patch continues to make progress, we'd finally have a centralised point for both modders and servers. It could be really nice, so we do have that to hope for in the future. The next thing I wanted to discuss is information sharing. The fact that in a community literally founded on the principles of sharing information, had PW Jones never published his packet captures, none of this would ever have happened. Various projects actively withholding data or information has always gone on my nerves, and a change to this culture was one of the things Winston called for in his Thoughts on LU video. It was one of those things that actually got Winston myself talking in the first place. So that makes the events of the other night really amazing, and something which will hopefully mark a step change in this community. The group I've been most critical of in this regard in the past has been DLU. It's become something of a joke in the development community that people ask them to release a set of server scripts to be public. These were scripts that were accidentally left in a client by a developer at patching time and contain a lot of information which is just otherwise unobtainable. Darwin has also had an XML to FTP converter just lying around for ages, and when asked why he didn't want to release it, he just shrugged, not really having much of an answer. I'm not a dev, and stuff like that just makes me feel as though DLU feels as though, that was a convoluted sentence, no one else deserves this information and content, and so I can imagine it's far worse for the developers who actually are actively working. And that's what's been the most amazing about this. We'd been discussing mods we could make to LU, and Winston posted a gif of mobs attacking one another in response to LCDR discussing an enemy v enemy mod. This seemed, those of us watching, as though the enemies were pathfinding, which drew quite a few surprised reactions. Winston explained, however, there was a reason he'd placed them all on flat terrain, but it got the discussion onto pathfinding. At this point, I was really surprised, in a really happy way, to see Darwin offer Winston DLU's Navmeshes. Now, this doesn't necessarily sound huge if you don't know what I'm talking about, so I'm going to explain it, but this is huge. I don't have a way of getting across them, so I'm just going to continue reading the script. The problem of creating AI pathfinding has been around for ages, and it is pretty much a solved problem with loads of existing libraries to handle it. The challenge in the case of LU, therefore, isn't the pathfinding algorithms themselves, it's generating what's called a Navmesh. Please enjoy that motorbike going past my window. The Navmesh basically contains all the information about where AI entities can move, and generating them from the game files is pretty non-trivial, requiring that a user exports the game to an objects file. The issues with this are that the meshes which we can view easily are not the same things as the physics you interact with as a user. They're very different and stored in a completely different file type, which is not at all well understood. Even using the more well understood visual meshes wouldn't solve this problem, since you need to load all the mesh files and the terrain files into a single world before running an algorithm to generate the nav mesh on it. It is a really non-trivial thing to do, which is why only DLU has demonstrated pathfinding so far. And so, to have Darwin just offer Winston those files and then publish them on a development channel, that really marked something amazing to me. But that wasn't the only surprise I was to have. Darwin then posted some notes he'd written on Happy Flower, which had previously been confined to DLU's Discord, which means that there's now a pretty in-depth tutorial available for those wishing to use Happy Flower themselves. So in a single day we got a mod patcher and 2 releases of what was previously DLU only information, which was why I was so excited to produce this video. This wasn't the sole extent to which Darwin showed himself willing to help out the community, but I can't talk about the other bit, so let's just say we made a lot of memes that night. Also, LCDR just developed a mod to change the font of LU, so you know, if you are interested in playing LEGO Universe with Comic Sans or Papyrus as a font, let him know. And so, yes, I'm really excited for this video. The other night genuinely seemed to be the most progress this community has made in all the time I've been here, just in terms of finally working together more than I've really seen, and that really excites me. And since modding is my thing, I'm really looking forward to beginning to work with all of these new tools. If you're interested in modding, give me a shout and I'd be happy to show you the ropes and get you started. And I do intend to start publishing tutorial videos on stuff like modding sometime soon. As a further sort of public service announcement about this channel, those of you who've been here for a while will know I'm interested in ways of making LU harder, and Winston's most recent attack update seems to be providing us with a lot more information than we've previously had about a certain challenge I've been investigating in LEGO Universe, so hopefully I'll be making a video on that sometime soon. I'm also considering live streaming when I work on LU stuff, just to give you an idea of what it all entails and hopefully encourage a few people to get started, so I will keep you posted on that and let me know if you think that's a good idea. And with that, subscribe to the developer channels in the description. Send some thanks DLU's way for doing this so that we can ensure it happens as much as possible in the future, and in general get excited about everything. We're entering a really interesting time with all this modding tech now available, and I cannot wait to see what you all can all manage to do with it. And with that, I've been Ninja LU. Thank you for listening, and I will see you around.